Something had changed in England long before anyone dared to call it peace. It wasn't announced in a treaty read aloud in a hall, and it wasn't marked by a victory song. People noticed it in smaller ways. The way mothers stopped sleeping in their clothes, the way farmers began planting full fields again instead of hiding seed, the way a village could hear a horse on the road and not assume it carried news of fire. For years, the sound that ruled the coast had been the warning. Horns, bells, shouting, frantic riders, followed by the same brutal work of counting what was left. Then, slowly, that rhythm weakened. The alarms became less frequent. The rebuilding became less desperate. And the fear, instead of flaring like flame, settled into something colder. The Vikings were already here. That simple fact is what created the silence. When danger is distant, fear has a shape. It comes and goes, rising with a rumor and fading with a calm horizon. When danger stays, fear becomes something else. It sinks into routines. It settles into the way people travel, trade, marry, and speak. It becomes practical. It stops screaming and starts calculating. England did not become quiet because it forgot what had happened. It became quiet because it learned how to live next to what had happened. By the time this new stillness took hold, the raids themselves had started to feel like a chapter that was closing. There were still attacks, still sudden violence in places that thought they were safe, still betrayals and revenge carried out in the old way. But the rhythm had changed. The great terror of the early years, the sense that the Vikings were a storm that could appear anywhere and vanish without leaving a trace, was fading. The reason was blunt. Storms do not build homes. The men who came from across the sea were no longer only coming to take. Many were coming to stay. England had spent so long bracing for impact that it took time to understand what it meant to share land with the enemy. The old logic had been simple. Defend the coast, defend the rivers, survive the season, rebuild. That logic worked only when the Vikings behaved like raiders. Once they behaved like settlers, everything grew complicated. A settler does not need to outrun an army. He needs to outlast it. He needs food, law, and the ability to keep neighbors from rising at once. He needs to turn fear into structure. That is where the Danelaw became more than a name. It was not merely a line on a map or a word used by scribes. It was the daily reality that half of England answered to different authority. On parchment, the kingdom still looked whole because kings do not like to commission evidence of weakness. But on the ground, everyone could tell where English rule thinned and where Viking rule began. The difference showed in whose laws were enforced, whose fines were collected, whose men rode the roads without being challenged, and whose banners hung in the places where decisions were made. For English families living near the divide, the change arrived like the slow tightening of a knot. The first sign was usually economic. A market that once served only local villages began receiving traders with strange accents and different measures. Coin might be accepted, but so would weighed silver, cut into pieces and judged by scales. A blacksmith could sell ironwork to both sides. A farmer could bring grain to a market under Viking protection and receive a price that was fair, or at least predictable. Slowly, people learned that the border was not just a threat. It was also a place where goods flowed. And where goods flow, people follow. Trade did not mean trust. It meant survival. At first, English merchants crossed into Viking-held territory cautiously, traveling in groups, paying tolls, watching hands for blades. Viking traders did the same in English towns, always alert for insults that could become attacks. But trade has a way of softening edges. It creates routine. It makes strangers recognizable. The same man appears in the market week after week, his voice becomes familiar, and familiarity is a kind of safety. A bargain made once becomes a bargain expected, and an expected bargain is harder to break without consequences. Soon goods flowed both ways with less hesitation. Livestock moved across borders, cloth and salt, iron and timber, tools and pottery. The Danelaw did not survive by plunder alone. Plunder is a spark, not a furnace. Settlements needed food that could not always be taken by force without provoking constant revolt. They needed cooperation, and cooperation was easier to purchase with trade than to enforce with fire. The Vikings themselves were changing under the weight of permanence. Raiders can live by courage and momentum. Rulers must live by restraint, and restraint is a different kind of strength. In the earliest years, Viking leaders had proven themselves through daring and brutality, through the ability to seize and hold the attention of men hungry for wealth. Now they had to prove they could keep peace within their own camps, prevent feuds from turning into civil war, and maintain enough order that farms could be worked and settlements could grow. A leader who could not control his own men would not hold land for long. Law became the backbone of staying. Assemblies formed where disputes were settled and compensation was set. Theft, assault, land claims, marriage disputes, these things mattered when people expected to live side by side next season. Violence still existed, but its purpose shifted. Instead of being the first answer, it became a tool used to enforce decisions and punish defiance. The threat of violence remained close, but it was no longer random. It was structured. That structure, grim as it was, made life more predictable than endless raiding ever could. English rulers watched all of this with a mixture of anger and reluctant realism. Some wanted to raise armies and push the Vikings back into the sea, but the strength required for that kind of conquest did not exist everywhere at once. Raising men for war drained farms of labor. Failing in a decisive battle could collapse the remaining heartland. Paying tribute could buy time, but it also advertised weakness and invited higher demands. Every choice carried a cost. So the English king focused on what could be held and rebuilt. Fortifications were repaired not for expansion, but for defense. Garrisons were positioned to protect key roads and towns. Messengers and local musters were organized to respond quickly where English authority still mattered. The crown encouraged trade because trade strengthened towns, and strong towns produced taxes and soldiers. It was a policy built around endurance, not glory. In border areas, the reality of daily life pushed politics toward compromise. A village that lay near Viking land could not afford endless hostility. Its fields did not stop growing because kings argued. Some communities made local agreements, promises of safe passage for traders, rules about cattle theft, arrangements to return captives for ransom rather than kill them. These were not always honored, but they were attempted, and the attempt itself marked a change. People were no longer living only for the next battle. They were living for the next winter. The church, too, adjusted to the new world. In the earliest raids, monasteries had been rich targets, symbols of vulnerability and wealth. Now, monasteries became something else, centers of communication, negotiation, and record. Priests could speak across regions. They could write agreements, witness oaths, and carry messages between leaders who did not trust each other enough to meet alone. Clergy often served as the closest thing to neutral ground in a landscape where neutrality was rare. Some Viking leaders accepted baptism. Sometimes it was true belief. Often it was strategy. A baptized leader could reduce friction with Christian neighbors, make trade easier, and gain legitimacy in the eyes of those he ruled. Conversion did not erase old gods overnight. Pagan practice continued in many places, openly or quietly. But the act of baptism could signal willingness to participate in the structures of the land rather than remain outside them. It was a handshake offered across a boundary that had once been only a battlefield. Cultural exchange followed, not as a celebration, but as an unavoidable result of proximity. English households began adopting certain Norse tools and methods when they proved useful. Viking settlers adopted English farming practices suited to the soil. Language blended at the edges, names changed shape, words crossed over, and a child raised in a mixed settlement might understand both tongues well enough to bargain in either. Clothing and craft styles borrowed from one another. Even law began to blend where mixed communities needed rules everyone could recognize. This blending did not mean the past was forgiven. Memories remained sharp. Entire families carried stories of burned villages and stolen kin. In some places, resentment sat beneath the surface like embers that could flare with one insult. The silence did not come from love. It came from exhaustion and practicality. Many people had learned that constant war destroys more than it protects. A farmer who wants his children to reach adulthood cares less about old pride than about the harvest. There were still moments when the old hatred returned openly. A Viking demand might be too heavy. An English lord might try to reclaim land by force. A feud could spiral into violence that drew in neighbors. But these conflicts were increasingly local rather than sweeping. The great back and forth that had defined earlier decades was giving way to a slower struggle over governance and identity. That is why the silence spread faster than ships. Fear no longer depended on the sight of sails. It moved through roads and market stalls, through travelers and priests, through the stories people told to warn each other. News of a punishment in one district would reach another district long before any fleet could. A village would hear that a neighbor had resisted and been broken, and that knowledge would shape choices before any Vikings appeared. The presence of Viking settlements meant that English communities no longer waited for the sea to bring danger. Danger could walk to them over land. The Vikings understood the power of that knowledge. They did not need to burn every village to control a region. They needed only to make examples that traveled. An execution, a confiscation, a public humiliation. These could be enough to bend a district without constant bloodshed. The economy benefited, the rulers benefited, and even the ruled benefited in the narrow sense that stability is better than ruin. This was not kindness. It was rule. On maps, England could still be drawn as one kingdom. In reality, it had become a patchwork of authority. In some regions, English law held firmly. In others, Viking law shaped daily life. Between them lay mixed zones where agreements and compromises were constantly renegotiated. A traveler could cross from one set of rules into another in a single day. The feeling of distance changed. Places that once seemed far away now felt uncomfortably close because power could shift quickly and borders could be crossed faster than messages could travel. And yet, within that smaller world, new forms of unity began to emerge. Not a unity of banners and speeches, but unity of necessity. Markets required safe roads. Farms required predictable seasons without constant burning. Towns required stable authority to collect tolls and maintain walls. When both English and Viking leaders wanted the same outcome, order, cooperation became possible, even if it was grudging. Some of the clearest signs of this came in joint efforts to police regions against threats that harmed everyone. Bandits and rogue war bands disrupted trade and provoked retaliation. Feuds threatened to drag whole districts into chaos. To protect shared interests, English and Viking authorities sometimes coordinated punishments, returned stolen goods, or agreed on rules for travel and tolls. These agreements were fragile, but each one built the habit of coexistence. In households, the shift was quieter but deeper. A child raised near the border might grow up with a different sense of identity than his grandparents. He might learn that the people across the line were not mythical monsters but neighbors with markets, weddings, and funerals. He might hear two sets of stories, the old tales of raids and terror and the newer tales of bargains, taxes, and law. Identity began to blur, not because anyone intended it, but because life insisted. After harsh winters, these changes became more visible. Winter has a way of stripping away pride and leaving only needs. When roads are frozen and stores are low, cooperation becomes more attractive than conflict. If a settlement can trade grain for iron, it may survive. If it cannot, it may starve. Winter pressed both sides toward arrangements that kept food moving and violence contained. The result was not harmony, but a calmer form of survival. Over time, the Danelaw ceased to feel like a temporary occupation and began to feel like a permanent feature of the land. That permanence forced English leaders to think beyond war. It forced Viking leaders to think beyond raids. Conquest became administration. Resistance became adaptation. The old language of victory and defeat began to fail because the reality was neither. It was transformation. England was changing, and so were the Vikings who had settled there. Viking identity, built on travel and raid, was being reshaped by fields and fences. English identity, built on a sense of a single realm, was being reshaped by division and coexistence. The question was no longer who would wipe out whom. The question was what kind of society would form where both remained. That is where the idea of uniting English and Vikings together became possible. not as a sudden declaration, but as a slow recognition that the land could not support endless civil war. In certain regions, the practical unity of shared markets and shared rules began to look like a stronger foundation than constant conflict. Leaders who could present themselves as protectors of stability gained support. People who had once demanded vengeance began to demand predictability instead. This did not erase the loss. England had been carved in half. Many had died. Many had been displaced. Entire ways of life had been shattered. The silence was not a blanket over a clean wound. It was the quiet that follows when people accept a scar will never vanish. The old England, the one that believed its borders were unquestionable, was gone. In its place was a land where borders existed but were negotiated daily by those who lived along them. And yet, in that scarred landscape, new strength appeared. English towns became more organized. Defenses became more disciplined. The experience of decades of pressure forged tougher communities. Viking settlements became more structured, less reliant on constant violence, more tied to law and economy. The longer the Vikings stayed, the more they became part of England's future, whether England wanted it or not. In the towns that sat closest to the line, the change was visible in the smallest details. At a gate, you might see an English guard collecting a toll the old way. Then, a few miles down the road, a Viking reeve doing the same thing with different weights and different words. In one market, a dispute over a broken cart would be settled by an English elder who spoke of oaths and kin responsibility. In the next, the quarrel would be measured in compensation, silver counted out on a scale, the wrong made paid for rather than avenged, because avenging every wrong would have made daily life impossible. Even the way people gathered began to shift. English shire meetings continued, but in many mixed districts, assemblies began to resemble the Norse thing as well. Men standing in a ring, arguments spoken publicly, witnesses called, decisions made not by distant kings, but by those with power on the spot. That local power could be brutal, but it was also predictable, and predictability is a form of safety. When law is visible, people can plan. When law is absent, every day becomes a gamble. The crown tried to anchor what remained by strengthening towns that could hold. Walls were repaired where possible. Stores were collected. Roads between key places were kept open because a kingdom that cannot move food cannot move soldiers. None of this ended the division, but it made the English heartland harder to break. In response, Viking leaders leaned into administration. They appointed men to manage land, collect rents, oversee markets, and keep order. Ruling demanded paperwork as much as swords, and the longer the settlement stood, the more the Viking presence stopped looking like an invasion and started looking like a government. Over the years, names on the land began to change too. Place names picked up Norse endings, English words absorbed Norse words, and the reverse happened as well. A traveler might hear the same field described in two languages, depending on who was speaking. Children grew up hearing both and thinking it normal. That, more than any treaty, is how the future begins. Quietly, in the mouths of the young, before anyone has decided what the world should be called. And still, beneath all of it, memory remained. Some evenings, in halls and by hearth fires, stories of the first raids were told again and again, not to inflame hatred, but to explain why the world had become this way. The stories ended differently now. Once, the ending was always vengeance imagined. Now the ending was endurance, because endurance was what people had actually achieved. So the silence that spread faster than ships was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of permanence. It was the quiet that comes when people stop expecting the next raid to solve anything and start expecting the next season to decide whether they live. It was the quiet of two peoples watching each other across a divide, then slowly learning that the divide was no longer a wall, but a seam. England and the Vikings did not become friends. They became something more complicated, partners in a land neither could fully control without the other. Former enemies traded, negotiated, and, when necessary, stood together against threats that would destroy them both. The world had grown smaller. Nothing felt distant anymore because power sat close and consequences traveled faster than any ship. That was the true end of the raiding age in England. Not a triumph, not a surrender, but a new arrangement built out of exhaustion, necessity, and time. The Vikings had come to take. They stayed to rule. The English had tried to resist. They learned to endure. And in the long silence that followed, a New England began to form, one that could no longer be drawn cleanly on a map because it was being rewritten in the daily lives of the people who had no choice but to share the land.